We're joined by the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, to talk more about this Treasury analysis outlining the full extent of the economic impact of those lockdowns in Victoria. One industry really badly affected is the arts sector, Lisa.
Yeah, absolutely. We've heard it. We've been reporting it over the last 6 months, but now they're trying to work out how do they restart. And if they do restart, are you going to want to go? You know, do masks have to be mandatory? Do the seats have to be so empty that it doesn't end up being profitable anyway? We're going to be speaking to Michael Castle, the producer who's bringing Hamilton the musical to Australia a little bit later. But we got a message from Jenny, who's in Queensland. She said that she went to the Brisbane Powerhouse on Friday night for a performance, and they've done a brilliant job of making it work again. So lots of effort going into it.
Michael Castle, the Australian producer, bringing Hamilton to our stages very shortly. Let's bring in the Federal Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg. Now, Treasurer, good morning.
Good morning. Nice to be with you, Michael.
A devastating impact, understandably, the lockdown in Victoria is creating. Household spending down 30%, spending on restaurants and cafes down 60%, accommodation down 80%. But do you honestly believe Daniel Andrews would keep the lockdown in place 1 day, 1 hour longer than he needed to?
Well, we haven't seen a definitive plan from the Victorian Premier, and just yesterday he said it's too early for that. Well, I disagree with him on that, and so do Victorian businesses and many Victorian families, because they need to hear more about the road out as opposed to a longer road in, with the talk of the extending the emergency powers for 12 months. If you remember, Michael, back to early on in this crisis, we worked with National Cabinet on a 3-stage process for easing restrictions. It had detail about the nature of the activities that were allowed, the number of people who could gather. It related to retail, to recreation, to restaurants. We haven't seen any of that detail from the Victorian government. And I know, as the Federal Treasurer, the cost to the economy is immense. I mean, we're seeing up to 400,000 people lose their job or see their hours reduced to zero. We'll have more Victorians who are on JobKeeper than the rest of the country combined. We know where this all started. It started at quarantine. We've heard expert medical evidence on that. What we now need to hear from the Victorian Premier is about the road out, about getting people back to work, businesses reopening, and of course kids back to school.
But how can the Premier, how could any Premier outline a roadmap out when daily infections are still more than 100, and when this Premier, as every other Premier, every other Chief Minister is doing, is listening directly to his health experts? So do we ignore the Chief Medical Officer here?
What we need to do is focus on the medical advice, but we haven't been told by the Premier what is an acceptable level of new coronavirus cases.
Okay,
we do know that
what's the medical advice you're getting? What is an acceptable level?
Well, again, we need to hear that from the Premier. What I do know is that yesterday there were 7 cases in New South Wales, yet that economy is open. That with the top testing and tracing that they've had there, they've been able to manage the virus. Yesterday there were 4 cases in Queensland. Outside of Victoria, jobs have come back and the virus has been controlled. In Victoria, the testing and tracing has not been up to the standard in other states. Quarantine, there's been huge mistakes, and we are waiting now till November to hear the outcomes of that inquiry. In the meantime, hundreds of people have lost their lives and hundreds of thousands will lose their job. We now need the Victorian government to provide more detailed answers and a more detailed roadmap.
One of the reasons it's a problem in Victoria more so than other states is the havoc this virus is causing in aged care centres, and that is on you, Treasurer. Your very own colleague Richard Colbeck accepted accountability for the failings, the many failings in aged care.
Well, we've heard that the deaths in aged care, the deaths across the community, have started with community transmission. And you saw advice, Michael. You saw medical expert advice based on genomic testing that 99% of those cases in Victoria's second wave can be traced back to hotel quarantine.
We agree on that, but the problem with the aged care sector is, and this was highlighted by the interim report of the Royal Commission, there haven't been enough plans and protocols in place to stop the spread of the virus in such a vulnerable part of society.
Well, you're right, they're absolutely vulnerable. The people in aged care...
And they're not being protected properly.
It's certainly the most vulnerable, and we're working day and night to ensure that they get the protections that they need. We have 1,700 Australian Defence Force personnel deployed to Victoria. You've heard the Premier contradict it on the issue of whether Defence Force personnel were offered to Victoria. They were, and that was rejected. Now we have a testing and tracing system which is not up to the standard of other states, and Victorians are looking elsewhere across the country and saying, why not us? Yet we don't hear about a definitive plan. I mean, kids are not seeing their friends. Grandparents are not seeing their grandchildren. Families can't go to work. Businesses have their doors closed. We're subject to curfews in Victoria. You can't move more than 5 kilometres from your home. The damage is immense, yet the Premier has not provided a roadmap out. Now, if these statistics from the Australian Treasury are not enough to bring forward an economic plan from Daniel Andrews to take Victorians out of stage 4 restrictions, I don't know what will.
OK, but I hear you, Treasurer. My kids can't see their friends. I'm lucky enough to have a job. I've got heaps of friends who've lost their jobs. But I'll go back to where I started. What's the alternative?
Don't you want answers? Don't you want answers,
But what's
Michael?
the alternative? Do we let this rip with infections still at more than 100 a day?
Well, what we need to hear from Daniel Andrews is what is the appropriate level of new cases in Victoria for him to open up stage 4 restrictions. It's only 2 weeks to go. The mental health impacts are immense. I was talking to one of Melbourne's leading restaurateurs. He's got 1,000 employees. Most of those are under the age of 35. He's had to bring in 2 psychologists to assist his staff. He was planning to invest tens of millions of dollars in opening new restaurants in Melbourne, but that has obviously now been all put on hold. There is so much uncertainty there, and as you know, when Victoria went into stage 4 restrictions, business reached out to us, the federal government, because they weren't getting a proper hearing in Victoria. There was so much confusion around the supply chains. Those interventions saved thousands of jobs. What we now need to know is the road out. We need to hear more from Daniel Andrews about the message of hope, not about an extended road in.
We're just about out of time. I know you've got another interview to get to, but just finally, Treasurer, you tweeted last night the Morrison government will do whatever we can to support Victorian families, workers and businesses. Why then are you cutting the level of JobKeeper for Victorians at the end of September?
Well, that statement is just false.
You're not cutting the level?
It was legislated for 6 months. We're extending it for another 6 months. We've just announced an extra 30...
But I just want to clarify for our viewers, it goes down. You are cutting it from its current level at the end of September.
It goes from $1,500 down to $1,200 in the December quarter and then down to $1,000 in the March quarter, and there is a 2-tier payment. Originally, it was scheduled for just 6 months. It's now going for 12 months. I mean, Michael, the Labor Party themselves had called for this payment to transition. At $101 billion, it's the single largest economic support program any Australian government has ever undertaken. In the words of the Governor of the Reserve Bank, it's a remarkable program. We will have more Victorians on JobKeeper than the rest of the country combined. The damage to the Victorian economy will go for years. And it's worse than first thought. And that is why the Victorian Premier needs to provide a roadmap out of stage 4.
OK, we'll leave it there. Josh Frydenberg, thanks so much for joining us on News Breakfast.
Good to be with you.